Welcome, find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you like, and let your breathing slow down. Tonight, we are going to take a long, gentle journey through one of the most ancient, vast, and endlessly fascinating places on Earth. We are going to learn about China. Not in a rushed or overwhelming way, but slowly, softly, fact by fact, story by story, allowing each piece of knowledge to settle into your mind like snowflakes landing on still water. There is no need to memorize anything. There is no test waiting for you at the end. All you need to do is listen, breathe, and let the quiet wonder of this remarkable civilization wash over you as you drift towards sleep. China is the world's most populous country, home to approximately 1.4 billion people, which means that roughly 1 in every 5 human beings alive on Earth today is Chinese. That number is almost impossible to truly comprehend. If every person in China were to stand in a single line, and you were to walk past them at a steady pace, it would take you thousands of years to pass them all. The country stretches across an enormous area of Eastern Asia, covering about 9.6 million square kilometers, making it the third or fourth largest country in the world, depending on how certain disputed territories are measured. From its eastern coastline along the Pacific Ocean to its western reaches deep in Central Asia, China spans an astonishing range of landscapes, climates, and ecosystems. The history of China is among the longest continuous histories of any civilization on the planet. Chinese civilization stretches back at least 4,000 years, and some scholars argue its roots go even deeper than that. The earliest Chinese dynasty that is supported by both archaeological evidence and written records is the Shang dynasty, which ruled in the Yellow River Valley from around 1600 BCE to around 1046 BCE. Before the Shang, there was the legendary Xia dynasty, which ancient Chinese texts describe as the first ruling dynasty, though its historical existence is still debated by archaeologists. What is not debated is that the region of modern China has been continuously inhabited and culturally sophisticated for an extraordinarily long time. The Yellow River, known in Chinese as the Huanghe, is often called the cradle of Chinese civilization. It flows for about 5,464 kilometers from the Tibetan Plateau eastward, through the less highlands and plains to the Bohai Sea. Its waters carry enormous quantities of yellow silt, which gives the river its distinctive color and its name. This silt, when deposited across the floodplains, created some of the most fertile agricultural land in ancient Asia, allowing early Chinese farmers to grow crops and support dense populations long before most other regions of the world had developed comparable agricultural systems. The Yellow River has also been one of history's most devastating forces. Its tendency to flood has earned it another nickname, China's Sorrow. Over thousands of years, catastrophic floods along the Yellow River have killed millions of people and reshaped entire regions. The Yangtze River, the longest river in Asia and the third longest in the world, runs for approximately 6,300 kilometers from the glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau to the East China Sea near Shanghai. The Yangtze Basin is home to roughly 1/3 of China's total population and produces an enormous share of the country's agricultural output. The river passes through some of the most dramatic landscapes in China, including the famous Three Gorges, a stretch of steep cliffs, swirling waters, and ancient rock formations that has inspired Chinese poets and painters for millennia. The Three Gorges Dam, completed in 2006, is the world's largest hydroelectric power station and sits on the Yangtze River. It generates enormous amounts of electricity, but also displaced over 1 million people from their homes and flooded hundreds of towns and countless archaeological sites beneath its reservoir. China's geography is extraordinarily diverse. In the far west lies the Tibetan Plateau, sometimes called the roof of the world, the highest and largest plateau on Earth, with an average elevation of more than 4,500 meters above sea level. The air there is thin, the winters brutal, and the landscape hauntingly beautiful, filled with high-altitude lakes that shimmer in shades of blue and green that seem almost impossible. The Himalayas form much of Tibet's southern border, and Mount Everest, the highest peak on Earth at 8,849 meters, sits on the boundary between Tibet and Nepal. To the northwest of China lies the Taklamakan Desert, one of the largest and driest deserts in the world. Its name in the local Uyghur language is often translated as "you go in, but you don't come out," a testament to its fearsome reputation among ancient travelers. The Silk Road, the great network of trade routes that connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, passed along the edges of this desert. And travelers would go to extraordinary lengths to skirt its most dangerous expanses. Caravans of camels carrying silk, spices, jade, and glassware would trudge through oasis towns that dotted the desert's margins, exchanging goods and ideas across thousands of kilometers. The Gobi Desert, which spans parts of northern China and southern Mongolia, is the fifth largest desert in the world. Unlike the sandy dunes one might imagine when picturing a desert, much of the Gobi is rocky and flat, a vast cold desert where winter temperatures can plunge well below freezing. The Gobi has been an important source of dinosaur fossils, and paleontologists have unearthed some of the most spectacular dinosaur remains ever found in its ancient stone layers. The first known dinosaur eggs were discovered in the Gobi in the 1920s by an expedition led by the American naturalist Roy Chapman Andrews, who some believe was a partial inspiration for the fictional character Indiana Jones. In the northeast of China lies Manchuria, a region of fertile plains and dense forests that has historically been home to various non-Han Chinese peoples, most notably the Manchu, who in the 17th century conquered all of China and established the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history. The forests of northeastern China are among the last remaining habitats of the Siberian tiger, also known as the Amur tiger, the largest cat on Earth. These magnificent animals, which can weigh up to 300 kilograms and measure more than 3 meters from nose to tail, once roamed across vast swaths of East Asia, but are now critically endangered, with only a few hundred surviving in the wild. South China is a lush, subtropical world of rice paddies, karst mountains, and tropical coastlines. The karst landscape of Guilin in Guangxi province, where thousands of pointed limestone peaks rise dramatically from flat valleys threaded with rivers and rice fields, is one of the most recognizable landscapes in Chinese art. For over 1,000 years, painters have attempted to capture these impossible-looking mountains in ink and watercolor, creating a visual vocabulary that came to symbolize the very idea of natural beauty in Chinese culture. Today, tourists from around the world come to float on bamboo rafts along the Li River and gaze up at those same peaks that inspired so many ancient artists. The Chinese writing system is one of the oldest continuously used writing systems in the world. Unlike alphabetic writing systems, which use symbols to represent sounds, Chinese characters are logographic, meaning each character represents a word or a meaningful unit of language. The earliest known Chinese writing dates back to the Shang dynasty and was inscribed on oracle bones, which were pieces of turtle shell or ox bone used in divination rituals. Diviners would ask questions of the ancestors or heavenly spirits, then apply heat to the oracle bones until they cracked. The pattern of the cracks was interpreted as an answer, and the questions and answers were then inscribed on the bones. Tens of thousands of these oracle bones have been discovered, and they give us a remarkable window into the concerns and beliefs of people who lived 3,000 years ago. They worried about harvests and wars and the health of their rulers, the same things people have worried about in every age. Modern Chinese writing uses a system of thousands of characters, of which an educated adult is expected to know around 3,000 to 4,000 for everyday literacy, though a full dictionary may contain 50,000 or more. The Chinese government introduced a simplified form of many characters in the 1950s and 1960s to improve literacy rates. And these simplified characters are now standard in mainland China and Singapore. Traditional characters, which are more complex in their visual structure, continue to be used in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and among many overseas Chinese communities. The difference between simplified and traditional Chinese characters is sometimes a point of cultural and political significance, as it touches on questions of heritage and identity. The four great inventions of ancient China, as they are known in Chinese tradition, are papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. All four had profound effects not just on China, but on the entire world. Paper was invented in China during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, or perhaps slightly earlier, and it gradually replaced more cumbersome writing materials like silk and bamboo strips. When papermaking technology eventually spread westward through the Islamic world to Europe, it transformed European society, eventually making possible the mass production of books. Woodblock printing was developed in China during the Tang Dynasty, around the 7th century CE, allowing texts and images to be reproduced in large quantities for the first time in human history. Movable type was invented by the Chinese craftsman Bai Sheng during the Song Dynasty in the 11th century CE, over 400 years before Johannes Gutenberg developed a similar system in Europe. Gutenberg's press, however, was better suited to the relatively small number of letters in alphabetic scripts, and it was his version that spread most rapidly and had the most immediate transformative effect on European history. Gunpowder was discovered by Chinese alchemists during the Tang Dynasty, probably in the 9th century CE, while they were searching for the elixir of immortality. They found instead a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate that burned with spectacular and dangerous vigor. The Chinese initially used gunpowder in fireworks and incendiary weapons, and by the Song Dynasty, they had developed early firearms, bombs, and rockets. The knowledge of gunpowder eventually spread through the Mongol Empire and along trade routes to the Islamic world and then to Europe, where it would ultimately transform warfare and reshape the political order of the world. The magnetic compass was being used in China by the 11th century CE, first as a tool for geomancy, the art of orienting buildings and graves in alignment with natural forces, and then as a navigational instrument. Chinese sailors were using compasses to guide their ships before the technology had reached Europe. When compass navigation spread to European sailors, it helped enable the age of exploration and the great voyages of discovery that connected the continents of the world in ways that would have been unimaginable before. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network of trade routes stretching from the Chinese imperial capitals in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, spanning some 7,000 kilometers and crossing some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth. It operated for roughly 1,500 years, from around 200 BCE to around 1450 CE, though trade along parts of these routes continued even later. Goods that traveled along the Silk Road included silk, tea, porcelain, spices, glassware, precious metals, horses, ivory, and much more. But the Silk Road was not just a highway for goods. It was a conduit for ideas, religions, technologies, art forms, languages, and diseases. Buddhism traveled from India to China along the Silk Road. Islam spread into Central Asia, partly through through Silk Road trading communities. The plague bacterium that caused the Black Death in 14th century Europe is believed to have traveled westward along Silk Road routes from Central Asia. Silk itself is one of the most extraordinary materials ever produced by human ingenuity. It comes from the cocoons of silkworm caterpillars, specifically the larvae of the moth Bomix mari, which feed on mulberry leaves. A single silkworm cocoon can be unwound into a continuous thread up to 1 kilometer long. The secret of silk production was one of the most closely guarded in the ancient world. Chinese law made it a capital offense to reveal the secrets of silk making to foreigners. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs out of China was death. For centuries, the Byzantine, Persian, and Roman empires paid enormous sums of gold for Chinese silk without knowing how it was made. Eventually, according to Byzantine legend, 2 monks managed to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China hidden inside hollow walking staves, bringing the technology to the West in the 6th century CE. Tea is so deeply woven into Chinese culture that it is difficult to imagine one without the other. According to Chinese legend, tea was discovered by the Emperor Shennong around 2737 BCE, when some tea leaves accidentally blew into a pot of boiling water he was preparing. The actual history of tea cultivation in China is somewhat murky, but by the Tang dynasty, around the 7th to 10th century CE, tea drinking had become widespread throughout Chinese society, and a complex culture of tea appreciation had developed. The Tea Classic, written by the Tang dynasty scholar Lu Yu in the 8th century, is a comprehensive guide to the cultivation, preparation, and appreciation of tea that is still read today. Chinese tea culture influenced tea traditions throughout Asia, and when the British developed their passion for tea in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were drawing on a tradition that had been refined in China for 1,000 years. Porcelain, often simply called china in English, is another Chinese invention that transformed world culture. True porcelain, made from kale and clay fired at very high temperatures to produce a translucent, hard, white ceramic, was developed in China during the Tang dynasty. For centuries, Chinese porcelain was the finest in the world and was exported in vast quantities along maritime trade routes to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, Africa, and eventually Europe. European potters attempted to discover the secret of porcelain production for centuries, unable to replicate the beauty and strength of Chinese ware. It was not until the early 18th century that European porcelain was successfully produced, first at Meissen in Germany, and then at other centers across the continent. The name China for fine ceramic ware is a lasting testament to the country that invented it. The Great Wall of China is perhaps the most iconic structure ever built by human hands. Not a single wall, but a series of walls, watchtowers, fortifications, and garrison stations built over many centuries by various Chinese states and dynasties. The Great Wall in its various forms stretches for approximately 20,000 kilometers across northern China. The most famous sections were built during the Ming Dynasty, from the 14th to the 17th centuries CE, using millions of workers, many of whom died during construction and are said to have been buried within the wall itself. The wall served primarily as a military fortification against nomadic peoples from the north, particularly the Mongols and Xingnu, but it also functioned as a customs barrier, regulating trade and movement. The wall did not always succeed in keeping out invaders. The Mongols swept past it in the 13th century, and the Manchu came through with the help of a Chinese general who opened the gates. But for generations, it represented the frontier of the Chinese world, the boundary between civilization and the vast unknown steppes beyond. The Forbidden City in Beijing is one of the largest palace complexes ever built and served as the home of the Chinese emperor and his court from 1420 to 1912, a period of nearly 5 centuries. It contains approximately 900 buildings and nearly 9,000 rooms, and the entire complex is surrounded by walls and a moat. The name comes from the fact that ordinary people were forbidden from entering without imperial permission. The color red, associated with good fortune in Chinese culture, dominates the palace architecture, while the roofs are covered in yellow glazed tiles, yellow being the color reserved for the emperor. Today, the Forbidden City is one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, receiving millions of visitors each year who walk through its vast courtyards and gaze up at its soaring roof lines with their graceful upward curves. The concept of the dragon in Chinese culture is entirely different from the European concept. In European tradition, dragons are typically fearsome monsters to be slain by heroes. In Chinese tradition, the dragon is a symbol of good fortune, power, wisdom, and the emperor himself. The Chinese dragon, unlike its European counterpart, is a benevolent creature associated with water, rain, and rivers. It is often depicted as a long, sinuous creature without wings, a combination of elements from many different animals. For thousands of years, the Emperor of China was considered the son of heaven and was symbolically represented by the dragon. The imperial throne was called the Dragon Throne, and the imperial robes were embroidered with dragons. The association of the dragon with China remains strong to this day, and many Chinese people affectionately refer to themselves as descendants of the dragon. Confucius, whose Chinese name was Kong-Qiu, and who lived from around 551 to 479 BCE, is arguably the most influential thinker in Chinese history. His philosophy, known as Confucianism, emphasized social harmony, hierarchical relationships, moral virtue, filial piety, and the cultivation of the self through education and ethical practice. Confucius believed that society could be ordered and harmonious if every person fulfilled their proper role and treated others with appropriate respect and benevolence. His ideas were systematically collected by his disciples into a text known as the Analects, which remains one of the most widely read philosophical texts in the world. Confucianism became the official state philosophy of China during the Han Dynasty and remained enormously influential throughout Chinese history, shaping education, government, family structure, and personal ethics for over 2,000 years. Taoism, another of the great philosophical traditions to emerge from ancient China, offers a very different vision of life. The foundational text of Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the legendary sage Laozi, and believed to have been written in the 6th century BCE, though historians debate its actual date of composition. The Tao, which can be roughly translated as the way, is conceived as the fundamental principle underlying and pervading all of reality, a force that flows through everything and that human beings can align themselves with through simplicity, non-action, and naturalness. Taoism values spontaneity, harmony with nature, and the release of artificial striving and social conventions. Where Confucianism emphasizes ritual, social roles, and effort, Taoism counsels emptiness, flow, and letting go. The interplay between these two philosophical traditions has been a defining feature of Chinese thought for 25 centuries. Buddhism arrived in China from India along the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty, around the 1st century CE. And over the following centuries, it was thoroughly transformed by its encounter with Chinese culture, just as Chinese culture was transformed by its encounter with Buddhism. Chinese Buddhism developed its own distinctive schools, texts, practices, and art forms. The Chan school, which emphasized meditation and direct experience over scripture and ritual, became one of the most influential forms of Chinese Buddhism and later spread to Japan, where it became Zen and from there to the rest of the world. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning, art, and commerce throughout medieval China, and Buddhist art produced some of the greatest sculptures, paintings, and architectural achievements in Chinese history. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, is often regarded as a golden age of Chinese civilization. Under the Tang, China was the most powerful, prosperous, and culturally sophisticated empire in the world. The capital city, Chang'an, which is now called Xi'an, was the largest city on Earth at the time, home to perhaps 1 million people, a cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants, monks, diplomats, and scholars from all across Asia and beyond rubbed shoulders in its crowded markets and elegant avenues. The Tang Dynasty was remarkable for its relative openness to foreign cultures and religions. Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism were all practiced openly in the empire. The Tang also produced some of the greatest poets in the Chinese literary tradition, including Li Bai and Du Fu, whose work has been read, memorized, and loved by Chinese readers for over 1,200 years. Li Bai, who lived from 701 to 762 CE, is perhaps the most beloved of all Chinese poets. Known for his vivid imagery, his romantic sensibility, and his deep love of wine, moonlight, and the mountains, Li Bai wrote poetry that feels immediate and alive even in translation. He is said to have drowned while drunk in a river, reaching out to embrace the reflection of the moon, though this story is almost certainly apocryphal. Du Fu, his great contemporary and friend, is often paired with Li Bai as the other supreme voice of Tang poetry. Where Li Bai soars with imagination and romantic feeling, Du Fu is grounded, compassionate, and attentive to the suffering of ordinary people. He lived through the Great and Lushan Rebellion, a catastrophic civil war that devastated Tang China in the middle of the 8th century. And his poetry bears witness to the human cost of that destruction with quiet dignity. The Song Dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279 CE, was a time of remarkable economic and technological innovation. China during the Song period may have been the most economically sophisticated society anywhere in the world. A vibrant urban culture flourished in the great cities of the Yangtze Delta. Print culture spread literacy to new social classes, and a sophisticated market economy developed that used paper money, bills of exchange, and commercial credit. The population of Song China grew to perhaps 80 million. Supported by advances in agricultural technology, including improved rice varieties brought from Vietnam that could be harvested twice a year. China during the Song Dynasty was in many respects closer to what we would call a modern commercial economy than any other society on Earth at the time. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in world history, conquered China in the 13th century, and the Mongol leader Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty, which ruled China from 1271 to 1368 CE. The Mongol conquest was extraordinarily destructive. The population of northern China may have fallen by tens of millions as a result of the conquest and its aftermath. But the Mongol Empire also created the largest connected trade zone the world had ever seen, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, and this connectivity facilitated the exchange of goods, technology, ideas, and diseases across the entire breadth of Eurasia. The Italian traveler Marco Polo visited China during the Yuan dynasty and described a civilization of extraordinary wealth and sophistication that his European readers found almost impossible to believe. The Ming Dynasty, which replaced the Mongol Yuan in 1368 and ruled until 1644, began with a burst of extraordinary outward energy. In the early 15th century, The Ming Emperor Yongle sponsored a series of massive naval expeditions commanded by the Muslim eunuch Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He's treasure fleets were enormous by any standard of the age, the largest ships the world had ever seen, carrying thousands of sailors and soldiers on voyages that reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. These voyages were diplomatic missions as well as trading expeditions, and they brought back exotic animals, foreign goods, and tribute relationships with dozens of kingdoms and states. But after the death of Emperor Yongle, the Chinese court turned away from maritime expansion. Later emperors actually banned oceanic voyages and ordered the great ships destroyed. If China had continued its maritime expansion rather than retreating from it, the history of the world might look very different. The Ming Dynasty also undertook the construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing and the extensive renovation and extension of the Great Wall. Ming blue and white porcelain, fired with cobalt blue pigments originally imported from Persia, became the most prized ceramic ware in the world and was exported in enormous quantities to markets across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The distinctive blue and white aesthetic of Ming porcelain influenced ceramic traditions around the world, including the Delftware of the Netherlands and eventually the blue and white china patterns that became ubiquitous in European households. The last imperial dynasty of China, the Qing, was established in 1644 by the Manchu people from northeastern China. The Manchu rulers maintained their own ethnic identity and culture, while simultaneously adopting many aspects of Chinese governance and Confucian philosophy. Under the Qing dynasty, China's territory expanded dramatically to include Taiwan, Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and other regions that together made the Qing one of the largest empires in history. The 18th century Qing emperors, particularly the Kangxi, Yangzheng, and Qianlong emperors, presided over a period of prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural flourishing. The great novel Dream of the Red Chamber, written by Cao Zuqian in the mid-18th century and considered by many to be the greatest work of Chinese literature, was composed during this period. It is a long, intricate, deeply psychological story of the decline of an aristocratic family, filled with beautifully drawn characters, especially its many female characters, and suffused with a melancholy awareness of the transience of beauty and happiness. The 19th century brought catastrophe to the Qing dynasty. A series of military defeats at the hands of Western powers and Japan, combined with devastating internal rebellions, massive population growth, and economic stagnation, progressively weakened the dynasty and eroded its legitimacy. The Opium Wars, fought against Britain in 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, were particularly humiliating. Britain had been purchasing enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but had been unable to find much that Chinese consumers wanted to buy in return. The solution hit upon by British merchants was to sell opium, grown in British India, to Chinese consumers. When the Chinese government moved to suppress the opium trade, which was devastating Chinese society, Britain went to war to enforce its right to sell the drug. China lost both wars, and in the resulting treaties was forced to open more ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong to Britain, grant extraterritorial rights to foreign nationals, and pay large indemnities. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Led by Hong Ziyuquan, a man who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and was determined to establish a heavenly kingdom of peace and equality. The Taiping movement captured large areas of southern and central China and established a capital in Nanjing. The rebellion attracted tens of millions of followers with its message of social equality, redistribution of land, and the liberation of women. The Qing dynasty, with eventual help from Western-trained troops, eventually suppressed the rebellion, but the human cost was staggering. Estimates of the death toll range from 20 to 70 million people, making the Taiping Rebellion potentially the bloodiest civil war in history. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901 was another convulsion of the late Qing period. The Boxers, members of a traditional Chinese martial arts society called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, rose up against the presence of foreigners and Christian missionaries in China, believing that their rituals and exercises had made them invulnerable to bullets. The Qing court, hoping to use the Boxers to expel the foreigners, secretly supported the uprising. When the Boxers besieged the foreign legations in Beijing, an international military force from 8 nations marched on the Chinese capital and relieved the siege. The aftermath further humiliated China, forcing it to pay enormous indemnities and allowing foreign troops to be stationed in Beijing. The Qing dynasty fell in 1912, ended by a revolution led by reformers and military officers who established the Republic of China under the presidency of Sun Yat-sen, often called the father of modern China. But the Republic was never stable. It quickly fragmented into a period of warlordism as military commanders took control of different regions and fought each other for dominance. Sun Yat-sen's nationalist party, the Kuomintang, struggled to unify the country. And in the 1920s, it formed a short-lived alliance with the newly founded Chinese Communist Party before turning violently against it in 1927 in a bloody purge known as the Shanghai Massacre. The leader who emerged from this period of conflict to unify most of China under Kuomintang rule was Chiang Kai-shek, a military leader of considerable determination and ruthlessness. The Japanese invasion of China, beginning with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, plunged China into a devastating 8-year war. Japanese forces occupied large parts of China, including all the major coastal cities. The Nanjing Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing, in December 1937 and January 1938, saw Japanese soldiers kill tens of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in the former capital city, in an atrocity that remains a deeply sensitive point in relations between China and Japan to this day. Chinese estimates of the death toll in Nanjing range as high as 300,000, while Japanese nationalist historians have sometimes attempted to minimize or deny the massacre altogether. The war left an enormous scar on Chinese memory and helps explain the deep suspicion of Japan that remains in China. During the war against Japan, the communists under Mao Zedong built their strength in the rural interior, organizing peasants, fighting guerrilla campaigns, and developing the mass mobilization techniques that would eventually carry them to victory in the Civil War that resumed after Japan's defeat in 1945. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists ended in 1949 with a communist victory. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan, where the Republic of China continues to exist as a separate government to this day. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong remains one of the most complex and contested figures in modern history. He liberated China from the chaos and humiliation of the preceding century, unified the country, and genuinely believed he was building a more just society. But the policies he implemented caused suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958 as an effort to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into a modern socialist state, led to one of the worst famines in human history. Mao's directives forced collectivization of agriculture, redirected agricultural labor to steel production, and encouraged local officials to report fantastically inflated grain production figures to show progress. The result was that while officials reported record harvests, actual food production collapsed and grain was still being exported. Somewhere between 15 and 45 million people died of starvation between 1959 and 1961. The Cultural Revolution, launched by Mao in 1966, was an attempt to reassert revolutionary ideals and destroy what Mao saw as bourgeois and traditional influences within Chinese society. Young people organized into revolutionary groups called Red Guards were encouraged to attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Temples were destroyed, books were burned, teachers and intellectuals were humiliated and sent to labor camps. And anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm could be denounced and ruined. The Cultural Revolution disrupted education for an entire generation, destroyed much of China's cultural heritage, killed hundreds of thousands of people outright, and caused immense psychological trauma that many Chinese families are still processing today. Mao died in 1976, shortly after the deaths of two other key revolutionary figures, Premier Zhou Enlai and military leader Zhu De, and after his death, the Cultural Revolution came to an end. The reform era that began under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping after 1978 transformed China with stunning speed. Deng, a pragmatic man who famously said it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, moved China away from rigid Maoist ideology and toward a form of market-oriented economics that he called socialism, with Chinese characteristics. Agricultural collectives were disbanded, allowing peasant farmers to sell their surplus production in markets. Special economic zones were established in coastal areas, attracting foreign investment and introducing export-oriented manufacturing. The results were astonishing. China's economy grew at an average annual rate of nearly 10% for the following 3 decades, the fastest sustained economic growth by any major economy in recorded history, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in what is arguably the greatest reduction in human poverty ever achieved in such a short time. Shanghai, which had been China's most cosmopolitan city before the Communist Revolution and had then languished for decades, exploded back into prominence in the 1990s as a global financial and commercial center. The Pudong district, which was largely farmland in 1990, became within 2 decades one of the most dramatic skylines on Earth, filled with soaring skyscrapers that rose from the east bank of the Huangpu River. The Oriental Pearl Tower, completed in 1994, with its distinctive pink spheres suspended on pillars, became an immediate symbol of China's new ambitions. The Shanghai Tower, completed in 2015, stands 632 meters tall and is the second tallest building in the world. Beijing, the capital, is a city of approximately 22 million people in the urban area, a vast metropolitan sprawl that has grown dramatically over the past few decades as rural migrants poured into the cities seeking economic opportunity. The city sits in a plain ringed by mountains, and its famous air pollution, caused by a combination of coal burning, industrial activity, and the exhaust of millions of vehicles, has been a serious public health problem, though efforts to reduce pollution have made some progress in recent years. Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics in 2008 and the Winter Olympics in 2022, becoming the first city to host both summer and winter games. The 2008 Olympics were a moment of intense national pride for China, a demonstration to the world of how far the country had come from the poverty and turmoil of earlier decades. China's one-child policy, introduced in 1980 in response to concerns about overpopulation, was one of the most far-reaching social engineering experiments in history. Urban couples were generally restricted to having one child, enforced through a combination of financial incentives, official pressure, and in some cases compulsory sterilization or abortion. The policy succeeded in dramatically slowing population growth, and demographers estimate that it prevented somewhere between 300 to 400 million births over the following decades. But it also had profound social consequences, including a sharp skew in the sex ratio, as some families, preferring sons, selectively aborted female fetuses or failed to register female births. It created a generation of only children, sometimes called little emperors, who grew up without siblings. And it is now contributing to a rapidly aging population that faces significant economic and social challenges. The one-child policy was relaxed to allow 2 children in 2015 and 3 children in 2021, and the birth limit was effectively abandoned in 2023, but China's birth rate remains stubbornly low. As urbanization and rising living costs have reduced the desire for large families. The Chinese language is one of the most widely spoken on Earth and also one of the most internally diverse. What is often called Chinese is actually a family of related languages or dialects that share a writing system, but can be mutually unintelligible when spoken. Mandarin, technically called Putonghua or common speech, is the official language of China and the most widely spoken, with nearly 1 billion speakers worldwide. It became dominant partly through the efforts of the 20th century Chinese state, which promoted Mandarin education throughout the country. But regional languages including Cantonese, spoken in Guangdong Province and Hong Kong, Shanghainese, Hokkien, and dozens of others still thrive in their home regions and in diaspora communities around the world. Cantonese, in particular, has a rich cultural tradition in film, music, and comedy that has made it a source of cultural vitality throughout Southeast Asia and wherever Chinese communities have settled. The Chinese diaspora is one of the largest in the world. Tens of millions of people of Chinese descent live outside mainland China, with particularly large communities in Southeast Asia, where ethnic Chinese have played enormously important roles in the economies of countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand for centuries. Many of these overseas Chinese communities trace their roots to the great waves of emigration from southeastern China's Fujian and Guangdong provinces in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when poverty, instability, and the promise of economic opportunity drove millions of people to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Chinese immigrants played essential roles in building the transcontinental railroads of the United States, working in conditions of great hardship for wages far below what white workers received. And they established Chinatowns in cities from San Francisco to New York that became cultural anchors for communities that faced severe discrimination. Chinese cuisine is one of the most diverse, sophisticated, and influential culinary traditions in the world. The enormous geographic and climatic variety of China, combined with a culinary culture that places extreme importance on the pleasures of eating, has produced a staggering range of regional cooking styles that are often quite different from each other. The bold, numbing heat of Sichuan cuisine, which uses the tongue-paralyzing Sichuan peppercorn, bears little resemblance to the delicate, subtle flavors of Cantonese cuisine. The thick, savory noodle and dumpling culture of northern China reflects a wheat-based agricultural heritage, very different from the rice-centered cooking of the South. Dim sum, the Cantonese tradition of small dishes served with tea, has become beloved around the world. Peking duck, with its lacquered, crackling skin, is one of China's most iconic dishes, and the ritual of eating it at a proper Beijing restaurant, where the chef carves the bird at the table, is an experience that has been repeated countless millions of times over the past several centuries. The panda, both the giant panda and the red panda, is native to China and has become one of the most recognizable animal symbols in the world. The giant panda, with its distinctive black and white coloring and its seemingly gentle, placid temperament, has become a global icon of wildlife conservation. Giant pandas live in the mountain forests of Sichuan, Shanxi, and Gansu provinces, where they subsist almost entirely on bamboo, consuming up to 40 kilograms of it per day. This highly specialized diet requires them to spend most of their waking hours eating. Although the giant panda is no longer classified as endangered, having been downgraded to vulnerable status in 2016 as a result of conservation efforts, their total wild population remains small, estimated at around 1,800 individuals. China has used giant pandas as diplomatic gifts and loans to foreign countries in a practice known as panda diplomacy, which has made these animals ambassadors of Chinese goodwill around the world. The crane is another animal with deep symbolic resonance in Chinese culture. Cranes, particularly the red-crowned crane, are symbols of longevity, fidelity, and good fortune in Chinese art and literature. They appear in paintings, embroidery, porcelain, and poetry across thousands of years of Chinese cultural history. The image of cranes flying above pine trees, another symbol of longevity, is one of the most enduring motifs in Chinese visual culture. The red-crowned crane, like the giant panda, is unfortunately endangered in the wild, though conservation efforts have helped stabilize its population. Chinese martial arts, known in Chinese as wushu or in the popular imagination, kung fu, represent a tradition of physical training, self-cultivation, and combat technique that is thousands of years old. There are hundreds of distinct styles of Chinese martial arts, each with its own techniques, philosophy, and history. Some are associated with particular geographic regions, others with Buddhist or Taoist temples, and others with specific families or individuals who developed them. The Shaolin Temple in Henan Province is famous for its association with martial arts and is said to be the birthplace of Chan Buddhism, brought by the Indian monk Bodhidharma in the 5th or 6th century CE. Whether or not the martial arts there originated with Bodhidharma as legend suggests, the Shaolin Temple has certainly been associated with martial arts training for many centuries. Shaolin monks performing remarkable feats of strength, flexibility, and precision have become a staple of Chinese cultural performance. Tai Chi, or Taijiquan, is perhaps the most widely practiced Chinese martial art in the world today. Though it is practiced more as a meditative exercise than as a combat system by most of its practitioners, its slow, flowing movements, which must be performed with precise attention to alignment, breath, and intention, are practiced every morning in parks throughout China by millions of people seeking health, relaxation, and a sense of inner calm. The philosophical basis of Tai Chi draws on Taoist ideas about the interplay of yin and yang and the cultivation of internal energy, or qi. Whether or not qi is a literal energy that can be cultivated and directed, the practice of Tai Chi has been shown to have genuine health benefits, including improved balance, reduced stress, and better cardiovascular health. Traditional Chinese medicine, which has been practiced in China for over 2,000 years, is a comprehensive medical system with its own theories of the body, health, and disease. It posits that health depends on the harmonious flow of qi, or vital energy, through a network of channels in the body called meridians. Disruptions to this flow can cause illness, and health can be restored through acupuncture, herbal medicine, dietary adjustments, and practices like Tai Chi and Qigong. The World Health Organization recognizes acupuncture as effective for certain conditions, though the scientific evidence for many claims of traditional Chinese medicine is limited or contested. Regardless of the scientific debates, traditional Chinese medicine remains widely practiced in China and increasingly around the world, reflecting a cultural preference for approaches to health that emphasize balance, prevention, and the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. Chinese astrology, based on a 12-year cycle in which each year is associated with a different animal, is one of the most widely known elements of Chinese culture outside China. The 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac in order are the rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. Each animal is associated with certain personality traits and fortunes, and the year of one's birth is believed to influence one's character and destiny. The year 2024 was the year of the dragon, one of the most auspicious years in the cycle, and it saw a notable surge in births in China and among Chinese communities worldwide, as families sought to give their children the supposed advantages of being born in a dragon year. The origins of the 12-animal cycle are ancient and somewhat obscure, but the system has been used in China for at least 2,000 years. The Mid-Autumn Festival, also called the Moon Festival, is one of the most beloved holidays in the Chinese calendar. Celebrated on the 15th day of the 8th month of the lunar calendar, when the full moon is traditionally at its brightest and roundest of the year. The festival is associated with family reunion, moon gazing, and the eating of mooncakes, dense pastries filled with sweet lotus seed paste, red bean paste, or salted egg yolks. The full moon is a powerful symbol of wholeness and family unity in Chinese culture, and the Mid-Autumn Festival is a time when families gather together to celebrate that unity. The holiday is observed by Chinese communities around the world, and mooncakes are exchanged as gifts in the weeks leading up to it. Chinese New Year, officially called the Spring Festival, is the most important holiday in the Chinese calendar. It is celebrated on the first day of the first month of the Chinese lunar calendar, which means it falls on a different date each year in the Gregorian calendar, usually between late January and mid-February. The Spring Festival is preceded by a period of preparation in which families clean their homes to sweep out bad luck, buy new clothes, and stock up on food for the celebrations. On New Year's Eve, families gather for a reunion dinner, one of the most important family meals of the year. The holiday is associated with red envelopes containing money given by elders to younger family members and by employers to workers, with fireworks and firecrackers set off to scare away evil spirits, and with dragon and lion dances performed in the streets. The Spring Festival travel season, known in Chinese as Chunnian, is the largest annual human migration on Earth, as hundreds of millions of workers travel home from the cities where they work to their hometowns and villages for the holiday. China's relationship with the environment has been deeply stressed by its rapid industrialization over the past several decades. For years, China was the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, largely due to its heavy reliance on coal for electricity generation. Many of China's rivers and much of its soil have been contaminated by industrial pollutants. Desertification has been a serious problem in northern China, where overgrazing and excessive farming have turned fertile land into desert. The government has undertaken massive reforestation projects, planting billions of trees in an effort to hold back the expanding desert and improve air quality. China has also become the world's largest producer of renewable energy, installing more solar panels and wind turbines than any other country. And it is the world's largest market for electric vehicles. But the transition away from coal is slow, and China continues to build new coal-fired power plants even as it invests heavily in clean energy. The Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric project in history, represents both the extraordinary engineering ambition of modern China and the profound environmental and human costs of rapid development. Completed in stages between 1994 and 2012, the dam stretches 2.3 kilometers across the Yangtze River and rises 185 meters above the river's normal level. Its reservoir stretches over 600 kilometers upstream, flooding hundreds of towns and over 1,000 archaeological sites. More than 1.2 million people were relocated from the reservoir area, often with inadequate compensation, and into poorly planned new settlements. The dam does generate enormous amounts of electricity and has helped control flooding downstream, but it has disrupted aquatic ecosystems, caused bank collapses, and contributed to the extinction of the Yangtze River dolphin, also called the beiji, which was declared functionally extinct in 2006. The first large mammal to be driven to extinction in over 50 years. China is the world's largest producer and consumer of many goods. It produces roughly half of the world's steel, half of its cement, and half of its glass. It manufactures more automobiles than any other country. It produces the majority of the world's smartphones, computers, and a vast proportion of the clothing and consumer goods that fill stores around the world. The phrase "made in China" has become so ubiquitous in global trade that it has entered the language as a byword for mass-produced consumer goods. China's role as the world's factory has driven its economic growth, but has also created environmental problems, labor issues, and geopolitical tensions as other countries have become deeply dependent on Chinese manufacturing, while also feeling threatened by China's economic rise. China's technology sector has grown with remarkable speed to become one of the most dynamic in the world. Chinese technology companies including Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, and Baidu have grown into global giants. Huawei has become the world's largest manufacturer of telecommunications equipment. Though its growth has been hampered by restrictions imposed by the United States and its allies over concerns about national security. Alibaba, founded by the charismatic entrepreneur Jack Ma in 1999, grew into one of the world's largest e-commerce companies, and its payment platform Alipay transformed financial services in China. TikTok, owned by the Chinese company ByteDance, has become one of the most widely used social media platforms in the world, with billions of users outside China. Though its Chinese ownership has made it the subject of intense political scrutiny in the United States and other countries. The internet in China operates under what is sometimes called the Great Firewall, a system of censorship and content filtering that blocks access to many foreign websites including Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Wikipedia. Within this protected environment, Chinese internet companies have built their own alternatives that have become enormously popular and sophisticated. WeChat, developed by Tencent, is not just a messaging app but a comprehensive platform for social networking, mobile payments, news consumption, gaming, and practically every other aspect of digital life. The average Chinese urban resident uses WeChat for hours every day and would find it almost impossible to navigate daily life without it. Weibo is a microblogging platform somewhat similar to Twitter, and Baidu is the dominant search engine. The South China Sea is one of the most contentious bodies of water in the world. China claims historical sovereignty over most of the sea, a claim represented by the 9-dash line on Chinese maps that encompasses roughly 90% of the sea's area. This claim overlaps with the territorial claims of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, and has been rejected by an international arbitration tribunal under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has built artificial islands on reefs and shoals in the South China Sea and installed military equipment on them, extending its presence in the contested waters. The United States and other countries have conducted freedom of navigation operations to challenge China's claims, and the South China Sea remains a potential flashpoint for military conflict. The relationship between China and Taiwan is one of the most delicate and potentially dangerous in the world. The government of Taiwan, officially the Republic of China, controls the island of Taiwan and some smaller islands, and functions in practice as an independent state with its own democratically elected government, military, currency, and foreign relations. China claims Taiwan as a province of the People's Republic and has not renounced the use of force to bring it under Beijing's control. Taiwan produces a majority of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips and is thus of enormous strategic and economic importance. The United States is committed by law to providing Taiwan with defensive weapons and to maintaining the capacity to resist any military action against Taiwan, though it does not officially recognize Taiwan's government. The Taiwan Strait, the body of water separating Taiwan from the Chinese mainland, is one of the most watched pieces of ocean in the world. Hong Kong, a former British colony returned to China in 1997, was promised a high degree of autonomy and the preservation of its distinctive legal and political system for 50 years under the framework of one country, two systems. For decades, Hong Kong maintained the independent judiciary, free press, and civil liberties that distinguished it from mainland China. In 2019, a proposed extradition bill that would have allowed suspects to be transferred to mainland China for trial sparked massive protests that brought millions of people into the streets over several months. The protests eventually subsided, but in 2020, Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law on Hong Kong that criminalized secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. And that has been used to prosecute many pro-democracy activists and journalists. The law fundamentally changed Hong Kong's political landscape, leading to the emigration of hundreds of thousands of residents and the effective dismantling of its political opposition. China has approximately 55 officially recognized ethnic minorities, in addition to the dominant Han Chinese, who make up about 92% of the population. The largest minorities include the Zhuang in southern China, the Hui Muslims who are distributed across the country, the Manchu of the northeast, the Uyghurs of Xinjiang in the far northwest, and the Tibetans of the Tibetan Plateau. The relationship between the Han majority and ethnic minorities has often been tense, and there have been serious human rights concerns about Chinese government policies in both Tibet and Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, the Chinese government has subjected the Uyghur population, a predominantly Muslim Turkic-speaking people, to a system of mass surveillance, detention in facilities that the Chinese government calls vocational training centers and that critics call concentration camps, and cultural suppression that international human rights organizations have described as cultural genocide. The Chinese government argues that these measures are necessary to counter terrorism and separatism. China is a country of ancient traditions and dazzling modernity, of profound philosophical depth and rapid technological change, of immense natural beauty and serious environmental challenges, of deep historical wounds and extraordinary contemporary achievement. It is home to people of extraordinary warmth, creativity, resilience, and ambition. Its history of poetry and painting, philosophy and discovery, construction and commerce stretches back further than almost any other continuous civilization. And it stands today at a fascinating and consequential juncture in history, as the world's largest country by population and second largest by economic output, navigating the challenges and opportunities of a position at the center of global affairs. Let your mind rest now with some of the quieter and more beautiful aspects of China. Think of the West Lake in Hangzhou, a serene body of water surrounded by pagodas and weeping willows and plum trees. So beautiful that the Song Dynasty poet Su Dampo compared it to the legendary beauty Zaishi. Think of the forests of bamboo in Sichuan, where the stalks grow so tall and close together that the light filters green and cool through the leaves, and the air smells clean and earthy. Think of the stone forest of Yunnan, where thousands of gray limestone columns rise from the earth like the petrified trees of some ancient forest, worn into fantastical shapes by millions of years of rain. Think of the ancient town of Lijiang in Yunnan, where cobblestone streets wind past wooden houses and rushing streams, carrying snowmelt from the jade dragon snow mountain. And old Naxi women in traditional dress carry baskets on their backs. Think of the terraced rice paddies of Yunnan and Guangxi, carved over thousands of years into the hillsides by generations of farmers, so that the entire mountain is transformed into a staircase of glittering water and green rice shoots that catches the morning light and reflects the clouds above. Think of the sacred Buddhist mountain of Amei Shan in Sichuan, wreathed in mist, its ancient temples clinging to the sides of sheer cliffs, its forests alive with golden monkeys who have no fear of the pilgrims who climb the mountain in search of spiritual insight. Think of the desert dunes of Dunhuang, where the Silk Road caravans once rested at an oasis before crossing the most difficult stretches of their journey, and where the 1,000 Buddha caves preserve some of the most exquisite Buddhist art ever created, sealed in dry cave chambers for 1,000 years and discovered only in the early 20th century. Think of the narrow water towns of the Yangtze Delta, Wuzhen and Ziding and Tongli, where the houses are built over quiet canals and the light reflects off the dark water up into the whitewashed walls and under the tile roofs, and old men fish from stone bridges in the morning mist. Think of the Mongolian grasslands in the far north, flat and endless as the sea, green in summer and white with snow in winter, where horsemen still ride across the vast steppe under skies that seem larger here than anywhere else on earth. Think of the turquoise lakes of Tibet, so high and clear and still that the sky is perfectly mirrored in them, and the air is so thin and pure that each breath seems to fill you with something more than ordinary oxygen. Think of the Lantern Festival on the 15th day of the first lunar month, when the streets of cities and towns fill with colored lanterns in the shapes of animals and flowers and legendary figures. And children carry small lanterns through the streets, and adults eat sweet glutinous rice dumplings filled with sesame paste and look up at the full moon. Think of the Dragon Boat Festival in early summer, when teams of paddlers race long, narrow boats carved and painted to look like dragons across rivers and lakes to the beat of drums, commemorating the death of the ancient poet Yuan, who drowned himself in a river in the 3rd century BCE in despair at the corruption and decline of his kingdom. Think of the Qingming Festival in spring, when families visit the graves of their ancestors, clean them, leave offerings of food and paper money burned for the ancestors to use in the spirit world, and remember those who came before. And think of this extraordinary fact, that all of this, the rice paddies and the pandas, the Great Wall and the Forbidden City, the poetry of Li Bai and the novels of Dream of the Red Chamber, the fireworks and the mooncakes and the dragon boats, the martial arts and the tea ceremonies, the bamboo forests and the karst mountains, the ancient oracle bones and the gleaming new skyscrapers, the Silk Road caravans and the high-speed trains, all of it is part of a single continuous civilization, one of the oldest and most enduring in human history. A civilization that has survived conquest and disaster, famine and war, revolution and transformation. And that continues today to create and build and dream and reach forward into an uncertain future with all the creativity and determination and complexity that has always characterized the people of China. Allow all these images and facts and stories to settle gently into your mind like leaves floating down to the surface of a still pond. The yellow river flows on as it always has, carrying its yellow silt to the sea. The great panda sits in its bamboo forest and chews, patient and unhurried. Somewhere in a morning park, someone is moving through the slow, beautiful forms of Tai Chi, breathing in, breathing out. The terraced rice paddies on the hillside fill with water that reflects the dawn sky. A candle burns in a temple on a mountain that has been holy for 1,000 years. The moon rises over the West Lake, and it is as beautiful as it was when Su Dongpo wrote about it 900 years ago. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts become quieter. Let the vast sweep of Chinese history and geography and culture spread itself out in your mind like a great landscape painting, ink and water on silk. Mountains and rivers and tiny human figures in the distance, dwarfed by the scale of it all but still there, still moving, still alive in the world. China endures, and you, wherever you are, can rest now, knowing a little more about this ancient and extraordinary place. This civilization that has been dreaming and building and thinking and feeling for 4,000 years, longer than almost anything else made by human hands, still alive, still speaking, still making its way through the centuries toward whatever comes next. Good night, sleep well, dream gently. And perhaps in your dreams you will walk along the Li River in the early morning, the limestone peaks rising like painted mountains above you, a fisherman casting his net from a bamboo raft, a heron standing still as a sculpture in the shallows, the water perfectly clear and perfectly still, and the whole world quiet and full of wonder. The ancient city of Xi'an, once called Chang'an, sits in the Wei River Valley in central China and has been a center of civilization for over 3,000 years. As the starting point of the Silk Road and the capital of more dynasties than any other city in Chinese history, including the Zhou, Qin, Han, and Tang, Xi'an holds within its walls layer upon layer of history. The ancient city walls that survive today were built during the Ming Dynasty and are among the best preserved city walls in China, stretching 14 kilometers in a near-perfect rectangle around the old city center. At night they are illuminated and can be walked or cycled around in a couple of hours, offering a quiet communion with 7 centuries of stone and mortar. Inside the walls, the ancient streets and neighborhoods have been partially restored or rebuilt, and the city has the feeling of a place where time moves differently. Beneath the fields outside Xi'an lies the most spectacular archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the terracotta army of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. In 1974, farmers digging a well in Lintong County struck what turned out to be part of an enormous underground complex containing thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, chariots, and weapons, all buried to protect and accompany the emperor in the afterlife. The first emperor, who unified China in 221 BCE after a brutal period of warfare among competing kingdoms, was a figure of extraordinary ambition and ruthlessness. He standardized weights, measures, currencies, and the writing system across his vast empire, built the first sections of what would eventually become the Great Wall, connected existing road networks into a nationwide highway system, and began construction of a tomb complex so enormous that ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing through an underground replica of his empire. Mercury has indeed been detected in elevated quantities in the soil around the burial mound, lending credibility to these accounts. The main burial mound itself has never been excavated. The terracotta figures are just the outer edge of a complex covering nearly 100 square kilometers. Archaeologists have barely scratched the surface of what lies beneath. Each of the terracotta soldiers was created with individual facial features, hairstyles, and expressions, suggesting that the craftsmen may have modeled them on actual soldiers in the emperor's army. Originally, they were painted in vivid colors, and traces of pigment can still be found on some of the figures, though exposure to air after excavation causes the colors to fade rapidly. The soldiers stand in battle formation in enormous underground pits, facing east toward the conquered kingdoms that the emperor subdued. There are infantry soldiers, cavalry soldiers, archers, and officers of various ranks. There are also acrobats, musicians, and government officials buried in nearby pits, a whole bureaucracy and entertainment company to serve the emperor forever. It is one of the most astonishing things any human being has ever made, and it was made over 2,000 years ago. The Qin dynasty that the first emperor established lasted only 15 years after his death, before collapsing in rebellion and civil war. But the institutions and structures he put in place formed the foundation of all subsequent Chinese imperial governance. The word China itself is believed by many scholars to derive from Qin, through intermediary languages, making the very name of the country a tribute to this brief but transformative first empire. The Han dynasty that followed the Qin lasted 4 centuries, from 206 BCE to 220 CE, and is regarded as one of the greatest in Chinese history. So important is the Han dynasty to Chinese cultural identity that the dominant ethnic group in China calls itself the Han people to this day, and the Chinese writing system is called Han characters. Under the Han, Confucianism became the official state philosophy. A civil service examination system based on classical learning was established, and Chinese territory expanded dramatically to include much of modern Vietnam, Korea, and Central Asia. Han Dynasty tombs have yielded some of the most beautiful objects in Chinese art history, including exquisite lacquerware, silk garments preserved in remarkable condition, and the famous jade burial suits, garments made entirely of small jade plaques stitched together with gold, silver, or bronze wire, with which the bodies of the wealthy dead were encased in the belief that jade would preserve the body and protect it in the afterlife. The examination system, which required candidates to memorize and demonstrate mastery of the Confucian classics and to compose essays and poetry in strict literary forms, was the primary pathway to government office in China for most of the period from the Han Dynasty to the end of the imperial era in 1912. At its best, the system allowed talented men of modest birth to rise to high office through demonstrated ability rather than inherited status, providing a degree of social mobility unusual in pre-modern societies. The most prestigious degree, the jinshi, required passing a series of increasingly difficult examinations at the county, provincial, and national levels, culminating in an examination held in the imperial capital that was presided over by the emperor himself. Only a tiny fraction of candidates passed all the examinations, and men who failed might spend their entire lives attempting and reattempting them. The great novelist Wu Jingzi satirized the examination system and the obsessive examination candidates it produced in his 18th century novel The Scholars, a biting and compassionate portrait of a class of men whose entire identities had been consumed by the pursuit of literary degrees. China has produced an extraordinary literature over its long history. The Book of Songs, the oldest collection of Chinese poetry, contains 305 poems believed to date from the 11th to the 7th centuries BCE. These poems, which include folk songs, ceremonial hymns, and odes, are among the oldest examples of Chinese literary culture and were memorized and studied by Confucius and all educated Chinese men for millennia. The poetry of the Tang Dynasty, as already mentioned, represents one of the high points of world literature, and the tradition has continued without interruption through the Song Dynasty's Ci poetry, a form written to specific musical tunes, and the Yuan Dynasty's songs and Zaju drama, through the great novels of the Ming and Qing dynasties, and into the modern era. The Dream of the Red Chamber by Cao Zukin, set in the prosperous household of the aristocratic Jia family during the Qing dynasty, is widely considered the greatest novel in Chinese literature. It is an enormous work, running to over 1 million words, with dozens of carefully individualized characters and a richly textured social world. At its center is the love triangle between the sensitive, poetic Beiyu, who is the heir to the family's declining fortunes and who from birth has been considered destined for great things, but who loves literature and the company of his female cousins and servants more than the career of official service expected of him. His delicate, brilliant cousin Dayu, who loves him deeply but whose pride and poor health make their relationship tragic, and his practical, capable cousin Beachai, who becomes his wife. The novel is suffused with Buddhist ideas about the illusory nature of worldly happiness and the inevitability of loss. And it contains some of the most beautiful and psychologically acute writing in Chinese literary history. In the 20th century, Chinese literature went through dramatic transformations as writers grappled with the crises facing their country and with the challenge of expressing a modern consciousness in a literary language deeply shaped by classical tradition. Lu Xun, often called the father of modern Chinese literature, wrote stories and essays of extraordinary power and clarity that dissected the psychological damage inflicted on Chinese society by Confucian tradition and by centuries of powerlessness and humiliation. His story, The True Story of A.Q., published in 1921, is a darkly comic portrait of a man so thoroughly defeated by life that he has developed a pathological psychology of what Lu Xun calls spiritual victory, reinterpreting every humiliation as a form of triumph in his own mind. It was read as an allegory of China's national situation and has been analyzed and debated ever since. Mo Yan, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2012, is perhaps the best-known Chinese novelist internationally. His novel Red Sorghum, set in rural Shandong during the Japanese invasion, is a hallucinatory, violent, and lyrical family epic that follows several generations of characters whose lives are shaped by war, collaboration, resistance, passion, and catastrophe. Mo Yan's prose style is exuberant and excessive, drawing on traditional Chinese folk storytelling, magic realism, and the brutality of actual history, in a combination that has been enormously influential in Chinese literature. Chinese opera is a performing art form that combines music, singing, martial arts, acrobatics, and elaborate costumes, and makeup in a theatrical tradition that dates back at least 700 years. There are hundreds of regional forms of Chinese opera, of which the most internationally well-known is Peking opera, which developed in Beijing in the late 18th century. Peking opera uses a highly stylized system of movement, gesture, and vocal production that must be mastered through years of intensive training beginning in childhood. The costumes are extraordinarily elaborate, and the painted face makeup worn by different character types follows a complex symbolic code in which different colors and patterns signify character traits. Red for loyalty and courage, white for treachery and cunning, black for bravery and roughness, blue for fierce and violent characters. The plots of Peking opera draw on historical epics, folk legends, and Buddhist and Taoist stories, and many of the most beloved operas have been performed for generations. Their words and melodies known by heart by dedicated fans. Calligraphy is considered in Chinese culture to be the highest of the visual arts, more highly regarded even than painting. The Chinese written character, executed in ink with a flexible brush on absorbent paper or silk, is seen as a direct expression of the writer's character, education, and spiritual cultivation. A master calligrapher is someone who has spent decades perfecting their control of the brush, developing their personal style while remaining deeply versed in the great calligraphic traditions of the past. The Tang Dynasty calligrapher Wang Zizhi is considered the supreme master of the art, and his works have been copied, studied, and revered for 1,500 years. Calligraphy is still taught in Chinese schools and remains a living art form, with major calligraphers still celebrated as cultural figures. Chinese painting, particularly landscape painting, or shan shui, which means mountain and water, developed a unique aesthetic philosophy very different from the Western painterly tradition. Rather than attempting to accurately represent a specific scene, observed from a fixed viewpoint, Chinese landscape painters sought to capture the essential spirit or inner life of nature through a combination of skilled brushwork and imaginative interpretation. Mountains and water, which represent the yang and yin principles of the universe in Chinese thought, are the primary subjects. The painter's goal was not to paint what was seen, but to paint what was felt or understood, to transmit through the movement of the brush the vital energy flowing through the natural world. The great Song Dynasty painter Gu Zai wrote that when you are going to paint a mountain, you should spend a long time communing with it and learning its inner nature before taking up your brush. The resulting paintings, often in ink on silk or paper, have a quality of meditative stillness and spatial depth that is unlike anything in Western art. The traditional Chinese garden, developed to its highest refinement during the Ming and Qing dynasties in the cities of the Yangtze Delta, particularly Suzhou, is a masterpiece of designed landscape that seeks to create an entire natural world within a limited space. Using carefully arranged rocks, water, plants, walls, and architectural structures, the garden designer creates a series of carefully framed views and experiences that evoke the feeling of traveling through a wild natural landscape while actually moving through a bounded enclosure. The humble administrator's garden, the lingering garden, the garden of the master of the fishing nets, and a dozen other ancient gardens in Suzhou have been preserved and are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Walking through them, one experiences a sequence of enclosure and opening, of surprise and serenity, of bold statement and delicate suggestion that is utterly distinctive and deeply satisfying. The music of China is as diverse as its landscape and cultures. Traditional Chinese music uses a pentatonic scale, 5 notes per octave rather than the 7-note diatonic scale of Western music, which gives it a distinctive sound quality. Traditional instruments include the erhu, a 2-stringed bowed instrument that can produce sounds of extraordinary expressiveness and melancholy, the gyukin, a 7-stringed zither that has been played by scholars and philosophers for 3,000 years and is associated with Confucius himself, the pipa, a plucked lute that arrived in China via the Silk Road from Central Asia and that in skilled hands can produce cascading waterfalls of sound, and the dizi, a transverse flute made of bamboo. China also has a rich tradition of percussion music, and the rhythms of drums and gongs accompany temple ceremonies, operas, and festivals throughout the country. Contemporary Chinese pop music, known as mandopop when sung in Mandarin and cantopop when sung in Cantonese, has been enormously popular throughout East and Southeast Asia since the mid-20th century. Artists from Taiwan and Hong Kong long dominated the mandopop world, blending Western pop production styles with Chinese melodic sensibilities and emotional themes. In recent decades, mainland Chinese pop artists have risen to prominence, and the K-pop influence from South Korea has also left its mark on the aesthetics and production style of Chinese popular music. The music industry in China is enormous and continues to grow rapidly as the country's middle class expands and digital music platforms make recorded music more accessible than ever before. Chinese cinema has a history stretching back to the early 20th century and has produced some of the most beautiful and powerful films ever made. The films of the fifth generation of Chinese directors, who came of age in the 1980s after the end of the Cultural Revolution and the reopening of film schools, drew on the rich visual culture of Chinese painting and the harsh historical experiences of their generation to create a new kind of cinematic poetry. Zhang Yimou's early films, including Red Sorghum, Judo, and Raise the Red Lantern, used color, light, and landscape with extraordinary intensity to explore stories of women trapped by tradition and oppression. Chen Kaiji's Farewell, My Concubine, which spans the history of 20th century China through the lives of two Peking opera stars, is one of the most emotionally devastating films ever made. Wong Kar-wai, a Hong Kong director, created a series of films including Chungking Express and In the Mood for Love that explored loneliness, desire, and memory in the urban spaces of modern Hong Kong, with a lyrical, impressionistic visual style that has influenced filmmakers around the world. The film industry in China has grown dramatically in recent decades to become the second largest in the world by box office revenue, after only the United States. Chinese blockbusters like the Wolf Warrior series and Ni Jia have broken domestic box office records, reflecting both the growing sophistication of Chinese filmmaking and the enormous appetite for entertainment of China's huge middle-class audience. At the same time, the film industry in China operates under tight political constraints, with the government censoring content deemed politically sensitive and requiring foreign films to be approved for distribution through a quota system that limits the number of imported films that can be shown each year. The Chinese education system is one of the most demanding in the world, reflecting the Confucian tradition of valuing learning and the deep belief of Chinese families that education is the path to security and advancement. Chinese students typically work extremely long hours on their studies, attend school 6 days a week, and often spend additional time with private tutors or in cram schools. The Gaokao, the National University Entrance Examination, is taken by nearly 10 million students each year and is one of the most consequential examinations on Earth. A student's score on the Gaokao essentially determines which university they can attend, and thus shapes the entire trajectory of their career and life. The pressure on students is enormous, and concerns about academic stress, mental health, and the narrowness of an educational system focused almost entirely on examination performance have been widely discussed in China for years. China's universities have risen rapidly in international rankings over the past 2 decades, reflecting heavy government investment in higher education and research. Peking University and Tsinghua University in Beijing, and Fudan and Jiao Tong universities in Shanghai are now regarded as among the finest universities in Asia and have research programs of genuine world significance. China produces more science and engineering graduates than any other country, and its investment in research and development has grown to rival that of the United States. The high-speed rail network that China has built over the past 2 decades is the largest in the world and represents one of the most impressive infrastructure achievements in history. China now has over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail lines, more than the rest of the world combined. The trains travel at speeds of up to 350 kilometers per hour, connecting cities that were once a day's journey apart in a matter of hours. The journey from Beijing to Shanghai, which once took 10 hours by conventional train, now takes 4.5 hours on the high-speed line. The bullet trains are comfortable, punctual, and affordable, and they have transformed patterns of travel and economic integration across the country. The construction of this network, achieved in just 20 years, is a reminder of what large-scale collective effort and enormous financial investment can accomplish. China's space program has made remarkable advances in recent decades, driven by enormous investment and the determination to establish China as a space power. China launched its first astronaut into space in 2003, becoming only the third country after the Soviet Union and the United States to independently launch humans into orbit. China has landed robotic rovers on the far side of the moon, a feat no other country had previously achieved, and has sent rovers to Mars. China is building its own space station, called Tiangong, which has been permanently crewed since 2021. There are ambitious plans for crewed missions to the moon and eventually Mars, and China's space program is widely seen as one of the most dynamic and rapidly advancing in the world. The question of what the rise of China means for the rest of the world is one of the defining questions of the 21st century. China's economic power gives it enormous influence in global trade, finance, and development. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, is a massive infrastructure investment program that has funded roads, railways, ports, and power plants in over 100 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, extending Chinese economic influence and deepening the commercial ties of dozens of countries to China. Critics argue that the Belt and Road creates debt traps that give China political leverage over participating countries. Proponents argue that it provides genuinely needed infrastructure to developing countries that would otherwise lack the capital to build it. China's military has modernized at extraordinary speed over the past 3 decades. The People's Liberation Army, as the Chinese military is officially known despite China's Navy, Air Force, and rocket forces being part of the same organization, has shifted from a massive but technologically limited ground force to a more balanced, technologically sophisticated military with growing power projection capabilities. China has built aircraft carriers and is developing advanced fighter jets, ballistic and hypersonic missiles, and sophisticated space and cyber capabilities. China's military spending, while still well below that of the United States in absolute terms, has grown continuously for decades and is now the second largest in the world. Soft power, the ability to influence others through cultural attraction rather than military force or economic coercion, is something China has invested in heavily in recent years. Confucius Institutes, funded by the Chinese government, have been established in universities around the world to teach Chinese language and culture, and to promote a positive image of China. Chinese media organizations, including China Global Television Network and China Radio International Broadcast in dozens of languages around the world. The global popularity of Chinese food, art, films, and traditional culture contributes to a generally positive perception of Chinese civilization, even among people who have concerns about Chinese government policies. The relationship between China and the United States, the world's 2 largest economies and 2 most powerful militaries, is perhaps the most important bilateral relationship in the world. It is also deeply complex and increasingly competitive. Economic interdependence is enormous. American consumers buy huge quantities of Chinese manufactured goods, and China holds large amounts of American government debt. But the two countries are also rivals for technological leadership, geopolitical influence, and the loyalty of third countries. The ongoing trade disputes, technology restrictions, military tensions in the South China Sea and over Taiwan, and the fundamental differences between an authoritarian one-party state and a liberal democracy make the management of this relationship one of the most important diplomatic challenges of our time. Despite all the political tensions and historical traumas and contemporary challenges, China remains a place of extraordinary human vitality and creativity. Its people, spread across the enormous variety of landscapes and cultures that make up the country, continue to produce art, literature, music, science, and innovation of remarkable quality. The young people of China today are connected to the global internet and to global culture in ways their grandparents could never have imagined. They travel, they study abroad, they start businesses, they make films and music and art. They grapple with the question of how to be Chinese in the 21st century, how to honor the deep traditions of their civilization while also engaging fully with the modern world. How to be both part of China and part of humanity. As you drift towards sleep, let the great river of Chinese history flow through your mind one more time, a river 4,000 years long, fed by a million tributaries of art and thought, and discovery and suffering and joy. From the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty to the screens of Shanghai skyscrapers. From the first fumbling experiments with silk to the high-speed trains crossing the country at 350 kilometers per hour. From the philosophical conversations of Confucius by the Yellow River to the novels of Mo Yan and Shandong. From the terracotta soldiers standing guard in their underground halls for 2,000 years to the astronauts floating in the Tiangong space station above the Earth. It is all part of the same long story, still being told, still unfolding, in one of the oldest and most extraordinary civilizations in the history of our species. And as you sleep, somewhere in China the sun is rising, and someone is practicing Tai Chi in a park, and someone is writing characters with a brush, and someone is cooking noodles in a hot wok. And the rivers are flowing, and the pandas are eating their bamboo, and the mountains are standing in the morning mist, just as they have always stood, patient and ancient and beautiful, waiting for the next 10,000 years to begin. Sleep now. Sleep well. You have traveled a long way tonight, through time and space and history and beauty, and you deserve your rest. China will still be there in the morning, vast and ancient and alive, continuing its long conversation with the rest of the world, finding its way through the 21st century as it has found its way through every century before, with resilience, creativity, and the deep memory of all that has come before. Rest now, breathe slowly, let the images fade gently as sleep comes to take you. The moon is rising over the West Lake, the bamboo is swaying in a soft wind, the lanterns are lit along the river. Everything is quiet and still and full of peace. Good night. The ancient philosophy of Feng Shui, which translates literally as wind and water, is a Chinese system of orienting buildings, graves, and spaces in harmony with the natural forces of the environment. Dating back thousands of years and rooted in Taoist ideas about the flow of qi through the landscape, Feng Shui practitioners study the contours of land and water, the direction of prevailing winds, the positions of mountains and rivers, and the cardinal directions to determine the most auspicious location and orientation for human dwellings. The imperial palaces and tombs of China were sited with great care according to Feng Shui principles. And even today, Feng Shui consultants are called in to advise on the placement and design of buildings in Hong Kong, Singapore, and increasingly in cities around the world. whether feng shui represents a genuine sensitivity to environmental factors that affect human well-being, or is purely a cultural belief system. It has shaped Chinese architecture and urban planning for millennia, and continues to influence the built environment of Chinese communities everywhere. The concept of face, or mianzi in Chinese, is a fundamental social concept in Chinese culture that has no precise equivalent in Western languages. Face refers to the social standing, reputation, and dignity that a person has in the eyes of others. It can be earned through achievement, generosity, and correct conduct, and it can be lost through public failure, rudeness, or improper behavior. Causing someone else to lose face by criticizing them publicly or exposing their failures is a serious social offense. The importance of maintaining face shapes Chinese social interactions in countless ways. From the elaborate courtesy of formal banquets, to the indirectness of business negotiations, to the way complaints and criticisms are communicated through intermediaries rather than stated directly. Understanding the concept of face is essential for anyone hoping to navigate Chinese social or business culture successfully. The ancient game of Go, known in Chinese as Weiqi, was invented in China over 4,000 years ago and is widely considered the most complex board game ever devised. Two players take turns placing black and white stones on the intersections of a 19 by 19 grid, attempting to surround and capture the opponent's stones while controlling more territory. The number of possible positions in Go exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe, making it the most complex deterministic two-player game known. For most of history, Go was considered impossible for computers to master. Then, in 2016, the DeepMind program AlphaGo defeated the world champion player Lee Sedol of South Korea. Using deep learning techniques to develop an intuitive understanding of the game that surpassed human expertise. The moment when a computer program defeated the best human Go player in the world was widely seen as a milestone in the history of artificial intelligence. Chinese Go players, including the current world champion Qi Jai, who was also defeated by AlphaGo's successor, have dominated the competitive Go world for decades. The Chinese concept of time is sometimes described as cyclical rather than linear. Where Western culture, influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions, tends to think of time as moving in a straight line from creation to apocalypse, Chinese culture has traditionally emphasized cycles. The cycles of the seasons, the cycles of dynasties rising and falling, the cycles of the Chinese calendar. The Chinese calendar is lunisolar, combining elements of the lunar and solar cycles, and has been used continuously for thousands of years. The 60-year cycle, formed by combining the 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, is a fundamental unit of Chinese time reckoning. The cyclical view of time can be seen as both philosophical and historical. Chinese history, with its recurring pattern of dynasties rising, reaching their peak, declining, and falling to be replaced by new dynasties, lends itself to a cyclical interpretation that has been noted by Chinese historians themselves since ancient times. The philosophy of the I Ching, or Book of Changes, is another ancient Chinese text that has influenced Chinese thought for thousands of years and has attracted interest from thinkers around the world including Carl Jung, Leibniz, and many others. The I Ching consists of 64 hexagrams, each made up of 6 stacked lines that are either broken or unbroken, representing the feminine and masculine principles of yin and yang. The hexagrams represent all possible combinations of change and stability in the universe, and through a process of random selection using yarrow stalks or coins. A questioner can consult the I Ching for guidance. The answers provided by the hexagrams are intentionally ambiguous and poetic, requiring interpretation and reflection rather than providing simple yes or no answers. The I Ching is simultaneously a philosophical text, a divination manual, and a meditation on the nature of change and the human relationship to the forces that shape our lives. As the night deepens and sleep draws closer, let your thoughts move to the everyday lives of ordinary people in China, to the rhythms and textures of daily life that are the real substance of any civilization. Think of the morning markets in any Chinese city, crowded and noisy before dawn, where vendors sell fresh vegetables, live fish, tofu, eggs, and the dozens of ingredients that will become the day's meals. Think of the grandmothers and grandfathers who take the children to school in the morning and pick them up in the afternoon. A practical solution to the demands of the modern two-income family that also keeps the generations in close contact in a way that is less common in many Western societies. Think of the ubiquity of hot food and the Chinese conviction that cold food is bad for the body, that the body needs warmth, and that eating properly is one of the most important things a person can do for their health and happiness. Think of the evening meal, the most important gathering of the Chinese day, with dishes shared among the whole table rather than each person eating their own separate plate. A practice that emphasizes communal eating and mutual care. The lazy Susan, the rotating tray placed in the center of a round Chinese dining table so that all the dishes can be reached by everyone, is a simple invention that expresses a whole philosophy of commensality and sharing. Think of the clinking of glasses at a Chinese banquet, the toasts of ganbei, which means drain the glass, the elaborate rituals of hospitality and face-giving that make a formal Chinese meal as much a social performance as a gastronomic experience. Think of the long summer evenings in the hutongs of Beijing, the narrow alleyways lined with traditional courtyard houses that have been the basic unit of urban life in the city for centuries. Old men playing chess or mahjong on folding tables in the alleyway, children on bicycles, the smell of sautéed garlic and scallions drifting from kitchen windows, someone practicing the erhu in an inner courtyard, the mournful, beautiful two-string sound carrying through the dusk. Many hutongs have been demolished to make way for modern development, but enough remain to give a sense of a way of life that is hundreds of years old, and that is still lived every day by the people who inhabit them. Think of the tea houses of Chengdu in Sichuan province, where people sit for hours in bamboo chairs, drinking tea, eating sunflower seeds, playing mahjong, gossiping, and doing nothing in particular with an air of supreme contentment. Chengdu has a reputation throughout China as a city where people know how to enjoy life, where the pleasures of food, conversation, and leisure are taken seriously and cultivated with skill. The city sits in the fertile Sichuan Basin, surrounded by some of the most productive farmland in China, and its cuisine is considered by many to be the finest in the country, a claim that would be hotly disputed by partisans of Cantonese, Shanghainese, Hunan, and several other regional cuisines. The hot pot, perhaps the most sociable of all Chinese cooking methods, is believed to have originated in Sichuan or Inner Mongolia. In hot pot dining, a pot of boiling broth sits at the center of the table, and diners cook their own food in it piece by piece, dipping thinly sliced meat, vegetables, tofu, noodles, and all manner of other ingredients into the bubbling liquid, and then eating them dipped in sauces. The meal can last for hours, the broth growing richer and more flavorful as the meal progresses, the conversation flowing along with the cooking and eating. In Sichuan, the hot pot broth is made bright red and numbingly spicy with a mixture of dried chilies and Sichuan peppercorns. In Beijing, a clear lamb broth is traditional. In Guangdong, the broth might be a delicate seafood or chicken stock. Whatever the form, hot pot is a fundamentally convivial meal, one that brings people together around a shared source of warmth and sustenance. Now let the story rest. Let the river flow on without you for tonight. Let the mountains stand in their mist. Let the pandas sleep in their bamboo. Let the lanterns burn quietly on the river. You have traveled far enough tonight. You have learned enough. You have earned your rest. Breathe in, breathe out. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let your thoughts become softer and further away. Let the colors of China, the red of the palace walls, the green of the rice paddies, the blue of Ming porcelain, the white of snow on the Tibetan peaks, the gold of the emperor's robes, blend together into the soft darkness behind your eyes. Sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep well, good night, good night, good night.